In 2009, Walter White made a decision that changed everything. Standing in a blood-soaked New Mexico warehouse, the air thick with the sharp copper smell of blood and gun smoke, surrounded by the bodies of Jack Welker's entire gang, with a bullet already tearing through his side, he did not fall. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once and held. He looked at the room around him, the debris, the stillness, the absolute finality of it, and something inside him that might have been relief settled quietly into place. He walked to his car, drove south, and disappeared. The DEA arrived 17 minutes later. They found the bodies, they found the blood, they found the Heisenberg hat on the floor, but they did not find Walter White. He was already crossing into Mexico. The border agent on duty that night later described a pale, thin man with a shaved head and hollow eyes who handed over a passport in the name of David Lynn, a retired school administrator from Tucson, Arizona. The agent stamped it without a second glance. He had no reason to look twice. The man in front of him looked like he was already dying, like someone who had already settled his accounts with the world and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. And in a way, he was. Walter had maybe 3 months left, according to the last scan he had seen. The lung cancer was not stopping. It was accelerating. What that meant was simple. He had nothing to lose, and a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing on earth. He drove to Culiacán, not because he had a plan, not yet. He drove to Culiacán because he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The Sinaloa Cartel controlled the largest drug distribution network in the Western Hemisphere, and somewhere inside that network was a gap. A chemical gap. The meth-flooding Mexican streets at that time was garbage, 40% pure on a good day, cut with everything from acetone to battery acid. Walter had cooked methamphetamine at 99.1% purity. He had done it in a trailer in the New Mexico desert. He had done it under pressure, under threat of death, with a partner who was high half the time. He could do it anywhere. And what he was about to offer the most powerful cartel in Latin America was something they had never seen in their entire existence. He rented a room above a hardware store in a neighborhood where no one asked questions, on a narrow street where roosters called at 4 in the morning, and motorcycles rattled past the window at all hours. The walls were thin, the mattress was hard, and the single bulb overhead cast everything in a dull amber that reminded him, oddly, of nothing he could name. He paid 3 weeks in advance with the last of the cash he had carried across the border. He slept for 14 hours, woke to the sound of traffic and distant radio music, ate a meal he barely tasted, and started writing chemical supply lists on the back of a paper bag. He did not call his family. He did not allow himself to think about Skylar or Flynn or Holly for more than a few passing seconds before he pressed the thought flat and put it somewhere he could not reach it. He was not afraid. Fear requires a future. Walter had already decided he had none. What he had instead was a window, a few months, maybe less, and inside that window he intended to build something that could not be ignored. The first contact came through a man named Rogelio, a mid-level Sinaloa distributor who ran product through 3 northern states and had a reputation for cutting deals with anyone who could demonstrate value. Walter found him the way he had always found things, methodically. He asked questions in the right places, spent money in the right bars, and waited. Within 2 weeks, Rogelio came to him. The blue meth had already started circulating. A small batch, just enough to create demand, just enough to make people ask where it was coming from. Rogelio sat down across from Walter in a roadside restaurant outside the city, the table between them sticky with the rings of old glasses, a ceiling fan pushing warm air slowly overhead. He placed a small plastic bag on the table. Inside the bag was a single blue crystal, identical to the ones Walter had produced in New Mexico. "Where did this come from?" Rogelio asked. Walter picked up the bag, held it to the light, turned it once, watched the color shift and fracture through the crystal, then set it down deliberately on the table between them. "From me," he said, "and I can give you 10 kilos of it by Friday." Rogelio laughed, a short, sharp sound. Then he stopped laughing because the man across from him did not blink, did not smile, did not shift in his seat. He just waited, his hands resting flat on the table, his expression carrying the particular stillness of someone who has already rehearsed every possible version of this conversation and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Friday came. 10 kilos arrived. The purity test came back at 98.6. Rogelio made 3 phone calls before noon. By Saturday evening, Walter White was sitting in a room with men who reported directly to the Sinaloa leadership. The room was bare, concrete-walled, and cold despite the heat outside. They were not friendly. They were not impressed by Americans. They had killed Americans before without a second thought and would do it again without losing sleep. But they were looking at a product they could not explain and could not replicate, and they knew what that meant in business terms. It meant whoever controlled the cook controlled the margin. And the margin on a product this pure was not comparable to anything they were currently running. Walter laid out his terms. He would cook exclusively for Sinaloa. He would produce no less than 50 kilos per month. He would train no one, share no formulas, and answer to no one except the man at the top. In return, he wanted protection, a fully equipped laboratory, and 20% of net profit from every gram sold. The men in the room exchanged looks. One of them, a man with a long scar running from his left ear to his jaw, leaned forward slowly, the chair creaking beneath him, and told Walter that men had been killed for asking for less. Walter nodded unhurried. "I know," he said, "but those men couldn't do what I do. I can. So we either make a deal today or I walk out of this room and have the same conversation with the Jalisco Cartel tomorrow morning. Your choice." There was a long silence, the hum of a generator somewhere in the building, a door closing distantly. They made the deal. What happened over the next 18 months was not a story about a man becoming powerful. It was a story about a man who already knew exactly who he was and finally had the space to operate without limits. The laboratory Sinaloa built for Walter in the mountains outside Culiacán was better than anything he had worked in since the Superlab. The air inside was cool and clean, scrubbed by industrial ventilation that moved silently through the ceiling. Climate-controlled, fully stocked with pharmaceutical-grade precursors sourced through shell companies in 12 different countries. Walter worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer, moving through the space with the calm efficiency of someone finally in the room they were always meant to occupy. The cancer was still there, still progressing, still announcing itself some mornings with a tightness in his chest that he had learned to breathe through and set aside. But in the lab it receded to background noise. He cooked, he refined, he pushed the purity higher. 98.6 became 99. 99 became 99.4. The product moving out of that mountain facility was unlike anything the global drug market had ever seen, and the demand for it spread faster than anyone inside Sinaloa had anticipated. Within 6 months, the blue meth was in Los Angeles. Within a year, it was in Chicago, Miami, and New York. The DEA's Chemical Analysis Division flagged it immediately. They had seen this signature before. They had a file on it. The file had a name at the top, Heisenberg, but Heisenberg was dead. They had the crime scene photographs. They had the death certificate. They had buried the investigation and moved on. Now a senior analyst in the El Paso Intelligence Center was sitting at her desk at 11 o'clock at night, the office empty around her, the building quiet except for the distant hum of air conditioning, staring at a spectrograph reading that matched a dead man's work down to the molecular level. She sat with it for a long time before she allowed herself to consider what it actually meant. Then she picked up the phone. She called her supervisor. By morning, the case was reopened. Within a week, it had been escalated to a joint task force. The official position stated in the internal memo was that someone had obtained White's formula and was replicating it. The unofficial theory, spoken quietly in the halls of the Albuquerque field office, was something no one wanted to say out loud, that Walter White had not died in that warehouse, that they had been wrong, that the man they had been hunting for 2 years, the man whose death they had processed and filed and moved past, was alive and operating on a scale that made his New Mexico operation look like a high school science project. They were right. Walter knew the investigation had been reopened. He had people watching. He had built that infrastructure carefully, paying for information from law enforcement contacts the same way he had learned to do everything else in this world, by finding the right pressure point and applying exactly the right amount of force. He was not rattled. He had expected this. He had, in fact, planned for it, because Walter White had not come to Mexico to hide. He had come to Mexico to build. And what he had built over 18 months in those mountains was not just a drug operation. It was a platform, a base of power so deeply embedded in the logistics of Sinaloa distribution, so critical to the cartel's revenue, that removing him had become structurally impossible without collapsing the entire financial architecture that the organization depended on. He had made himself indispensable. He had done it deliberately from the first week. because he understood that the only protection worth having in this world was the protection that came from being too valuable to kill. He had one more move to make. In 2011, Walter White crossed back into the United States for the first time since his disappearance. He entered through a tunnel running beneath a house in Nogales, Arizona, low-ceilinged, damp, lit by bare bulbs strung at intervals along the earthen walls, the same tunnel Sinaloa used to move product north 3 times a week. He was carrying no drugs. He was carrying a single briefcase. Inside the briefcase was a proposal, not a criminal proposal, a business proposal structured like a corporate acquisition, for the complete takeover of the distribution networks currently operated by 4 rival organizations in the American Southwest. The proposal included financial projections, operational timelines, and a list of 37 law enforcement officials whose cooperation had already been secured. He was 49 years old. He had late-stage lung cancer. He had an army, a laboratory in the mountains, and more money than his family could spend in 4 generations. And the DEA task force assigned to find him had no idea he was already home. 3 weeks after Walter crossed back into the United States, a DEA informant in Phoenix reported something unusual to his handler. A shipment of blue meth had arrived in the city, unlike any they had previously intercepted. The packaging was different, the quantity was different, and stamped on the inside of each individual wrap, in a detail so small it required a magnifying glass to read, was a single letter,